Patrick was generous. He gave 2 options. If he wanted to answer, he should raise his right hand, if not the left. Seeing the right hand raised, he said it was a wise choice, and he'd ensure a quick and painless death. Seeing the middle finger raised instead, Patrick hadn't expected such defiance, so he would respect his decision, hoping that his death wouldn't be quick. Walking around, Patrick wondered when he'd have to clean all that up again, but it would definitely be easier than the last time. Their friend was still alive and wanted to make sure the skeleton was no longer there. He looked down slowly. In his lap was the body of the green-haired mage. He gazed at her carefully while still injured. He stroked her face as he apologized. His mouth began to change suddenly, and he was apologizing because he needed to survive. Patrick said those sounds were unpleasant, and he knew something had been hidden there. Consuming bodies makes her stronger and heals her wounds, but he didn't know if it was cumulative or limited to human bodies. Since there were plenty of bodies around, he'd take all the time he needed to test the possibilities. Either way, he wanted to know where his boss was and what he was doing now. He just hoped he wasn't doing anything weird in an even stranger place. Swald was in the midst of battle. Bodies burned all around, and he asked if the girl was also there to meet the same fate as the others. Prepared for battle, she said no. She was Historia, a hero of the Empire. Swald said he never cared to know her name, admired her spirit, but she would never defeat him here. Historia readied herself to attack, knowing he might be right about that. Then, for a moment, he was surprised by what he saw. She struck him once more, knowing she had to stop him. After the blow, she realized it had been caught by a bare hand. Swald says she would only hit him once, no more than that. He commanded her to flee if she was even capable of doing so now. It didn't take long before she felt her whole body move. He had thrown her to the ground as if she were nothing, and it was becoming increasingly clear that she couldn't do anything. The blows were strong enough to make her agonize, and all she hoped was that she had bought some time. She is a hero, and her duty as one is to protect the people. Swald lifted her with one hand, wondering aloud if it was over. While still being held, she repeated once again that she is Wuan Historia and a hero. Because of that, she couldn't perish like this. She couldn't allow that monster to do whatever he wanted, much less attack the people of her land, and then a blue energy began to surge around her. She screamed as she prepared to strike him with one of her hands. Her hand struck him, but it did nothing. He didn't even move. Slowly, her fingers began to falter, weakened. He finally let her go, congratulating her for not having died in vain. He said he would remember her name, though he didn't know for how long. And in respect for her perseverance, there was only one thing he could do: ensure her a quick and painless death. But before he could do anything, something struck him. He turned around to see who the brave soul was who had dared to attack him. He asked if they were sausages, since they always come one after another tied together. They said they had taken drastic measures to save Wuan and apologized for being rude, but Swald retorted that one doesn't apologize for attacking from behind. Greetings, though they are belated, said the young man. He is Arl the Black Tigers, and he is honored to meet the almighty Lord Swallow. Now, Swald wanted to know how he had been identified as Lord Swallow. The young man said he had a talented subordinate who was able to recognize him. His smile concealed something, and Swald said he was in no mood now. He added that they were wasting time if their intention was to attack him after so much talking. But they didn't intend to attack. On the contrary, they had come to offer a deal. Swald merely laughed at those words. It did make sense to make a deal with him. He had no regrets, and they should choose their words wisely, as their suffering would depend on them. The young man knew it was a gamble, one that involved the Empire's safety. He then said that the one who wielded the decapitating blade was still alive. He imagined that Swald hadn't come just to retrieve that item. There must be more to it, and he wanted to help with whatever Swald desired. Swald wanted to know what they would do if he said he didn't need their help with anything, and he started walking toward them. Maybe he had come just because he had nothing better to do and decided to butcher some people to pass the time. Very close to them, he asked what they would do if that were his answer. But if he were going to destroy everything anyway, they should at least try. Swald realized that what they wanted to avoid was destruction. If that's what they wanted, they needed to find the blade's wielder immediately. The young man replied that they would do as he commanded and called for Garrot. He said they must have met before. To find someone, she needed access to an object that carried traces of that person, and she asked if it was alright to examine the blade. Swald warned that if she did something foolish, she would lose much more than just an arm. She said she was already aware of the consequences. Touching the item, she felt that someone had left a significant trace. The person was far away but moving westward, and Swald knew that was toward Harston. He said that was enough. Remembering Renee, he felt grateful that she was still alive. He sighed in relief, much to the surprise of those around him. He said he was indebted to them and he would remember both of them. The young man said it was an honor to help. Swald continued on his way, telling them to get out of his path. Elsewhere, Mel's greeted Swald's arrival. With enemies scattered across the ground, she said he had taken longer than expected. He stood there before her, looking at the pile of bodies. She was pleased to have fulfilled her part of the agreement protecting the teleport hub or teleportation axis, but she was very weakened and said that with this, she should have repaid her debt to him. He caught her before she could fall to the ground and said yes, the debt was indeed repaid. He thanked her for working so hard. Before the machinery, he tried to understand how it worked, The coordinates were set for Harston, and now he needed to infuse some of his mana into it. But the object began to crack spontaneously. It shattered, and a blue liquid began to pour out in all directions. Swallowed was disappointed that it hadn't withstood his mana, feeling confident since his polymorph was stable. Perhaps if he used Demura's mana suppressor, he could teleport safely. He would need to undo his polymorph, but that would announce his presence to every living being. However, he had already come too far. Now was not the time to worry about such things. He then removed the bracelet he was wearing. Energy started pouring out from his back, and he apologized to Patrick. The entire place immediately began to tremble. Several black tentacles started to emerge from everywhere. The building he was in was instantly destroyed. Swald had now taken a different form, one that no longer resembled a human. The coordinates were set for Harston, the magic tower, the wing. A large tower stood out in the middle of the city. A young man welcomed the visitors, checking the data of those arriving. In front of him stood Renee, who asked if the human could use transfer magic. But he said no, there was a resistor in the tower that prevented that, so access was only possible after verification. She drew a few blades and said you wouldn't be able to escape then. It didn't take long for the floor to be stained with tomato sauce. The first time she came there, she had thought out a few things. Human magic towers are very similar to dungeons. They're essentially dungeons but made by humans. Renee made her way through the place, as those humans were like very weak monsters. Continuing her path, she knew she had taken care of all the humans on the first floor. Now she was climbing the stairs toward what she had come to find. There was only one thing left, the last floor of that tower. The woman greeted her and said she expected more, but it was just the little girl she had met before. From the looks of it, this girl was not human. Renee asked the woman where the decapitating blade was, but the mage said that it was now her property and it made no sense to say where it was. Still, there was something that piqued her curiosity. That girl standing before her. The mage wanted to know how she was still alive. Renee didn't respond, instead preparing to attack. At this, the mage smiled, saying that Renee wielded a weapon that didn't match her delicate appearance. She underestimated her, claiming she was the master of that tower, and her adversary only had blades in her favor. Using a blade without attributes against her was practically useless. However, the mage soon realized her magical barrier had done nothing. The being before her wasn't a girl, it was a monster, and she couldn't tell how strong it was. Even so, that tower was built on a mana spring. If she used it to her advantage, she could win. Renee pressed on with her attack, demanding to know where the decapitating blade was. She told the mage to hurry and answer her, but the blade was no longer there, having been sent to auction. The mage then invoked a magic that engulfed the area where they stood. She admitted that the girl seemed quite strong, so she would use everything she had from the start and prepared a powerful spell. Then she cast a few more to increase the attack's efficiency, and soon several spears were flying toward Renee. The girl watched the attack closely. From outside, it was clear that one of the tower's walls had shattered from an internal explosion. Things had gone just as the mage predicted. This was the inevitable result of what happens to a monster pretending to be human. It was a powerful magic, something not even dungeon bosses could withstand. There was no way she could have survived. But it didn't take long for the mage to realize something was wrong. Her hands had suddenly exploded. She was in agony, unsure of how that had happened to her hands. Renee calmly said that all she did was make her hands disappear, and that the human shouldn't make such a fuss about it. The mage was in shock, and Renee kicked her. The mage tried to crawl away, begging for someone to save her. But soon she collapsed from her injuries. It was over. Every trace of Renee had been erased. The question now was what she would do next. What remained for her to do? She was exhausted and couldn't afford to lose consciousness now. She heard people approaching the place following the mage. A man arrived and went to aid the mage. He told her to hold on and keep fighting, but the mage muttered weakly. The man realized what he needed to do was finish off the one who had caused this misery. Renee looked at the man, a bit intrigued by what he could possibly do. But he continued aiding the mage, telling her to stay calm as she had lost a lot of tomato sauce, and he presented a stone to her. She couldn't quite see it as her vision was blurred. He explained it was a mana stone which she couldn't activate, but with her mana, it would be possible. Renee realized that the essence inside that stone was the same as the one in the stone of love. She couldn't forget that unpleasant sensation. The mage thanked him, believing that thanks to the stone, she would survive. But that wasn't what she expected. Soon, she began to writhe in pain. As she agonized, the man casually mentioned that the mage had many enemies. He had received an order to dispose of her if she started behaving suspiciously. Looking at Renee, who was still standing there, he asked if that wasn't true. He thanked her for doing his job, but given the way things were, he realized she might come after him as well. Now the mage's body began to transform into something horrifying. This was in fact his guarantee that he would have enough time to escape. Renee, unable to see out of one of her eyes and with a tired body and no proper weapon, faced an opponent she couldn't easily defeat. Still, it would have to be enough. Pathetic, was all Renee said about the monster before her. She knew she would have to pay the price here, erasing every last trace of herself. But she was furious. The beast had no right to try and cover up Lord Swallow's tracks with those hands. Even if she perished, Renee continued to fight. One of the tentacles struck her violently. All she could think about was whether Lord Swallow would be sad to discover that she had been killed. Outside, the tower shattered once more from the ongoing battle. Now it was Swald who stood outside, having completely destroyed the tower. He immediately asked if Renee was alright. The first time he had saved her was in a similar situation, powerless and unsure of her purpose. In both instances, it was Lord Swallow who saved her. Now she was certain it was Swald who had saved her, and looked at him in disbelief. He reached down and gently helped her to her feet. She still didn't know what he was doing there, but Swald asked her to wait a moment. It was so absurd that Renee wondered if she was hallucinating. But before her stood the monster formed from the mage's body. Swald, with little patience left, was ready to tear that mass of tentacles apart. His appearance began to change as he prepared to attack. The first blow he delivered caused devastating damage. That poor monster didn't know its place. Its agonizing screams echoed throughout the city. It began to be slowly absorbed. Swald watched with disdain as this happened. He lifted what was left of the monster with one hand. Then he began to slam it into the ground. It didn't take long for its body to become completely disfigured. He grabbed it once more. Small tentacles began to form around his hand, but every effort was utterly futile. Swald struck again, disgusted by what had happened. A massive explosion occurred suddenly. Now all that remained on the ground was the monster's blood. His hand was stained with that bluish liquid. Now he understood how it had kept regenerating endlessly. The monster slowly began to regain its form. Its source of power was the mana from the magic tower. Swald stood still as the creature's tentacles approached him. Now that he knew how it worked, things would be even easier. In a different form, he grew so large that he could swallow the city whole. With a single bite, he devoured it entirely. The taste was, without a doubt, one of the worst in his life. He slowly approached Renee. As he drew closer, he called her by name. Faced with her silence, he sat down beside her. There were so many things he wanted to say to her, but the moment he found her, he forgot them all. He should have written them down. He mentioned meeting a green-haired woman along the way, but he had killed her and wondered if that would cause a problem. But Renee remained silent. Being direct, he apologized for what he had done a few days ago. Renee was crying without making a sound. She said that he wasn't the one who should apologize. It was her. She had no right to look at him. Swald said that the center of the elders needed a guardian named Renee, and he needed her too. Renee asked if he held any resentment toward her, and Swald replied that he did not. She also asked if he hated her, but again, he said he didn't. In fact, there was something he wanted to give her. He extended the decapitating blade to her, saying it was an item she had forgotten. Renee hadn't expected to find her blade, let alone have Swald return it to her. Embracing it, she began to cry even more. Now she shared how she was feeling. She had been so afraid of being abandoned and hated by Swald. But he told her that not only did he not hate her, but he would never abandon her. Now it was time for both of them to return to the center of the elders. Meanwhile, the dog said it had found the homunculus in Grappina, and again in the laboratory. It had brought her along as it seemed like destiny. Patrick asked if that body held all the knowledge for the production of homunculi. Furthermore, even in the dungeon's main hall, she hadn't shown any emotion. Due to the energy of the place, she certainly had the mental and physical strength to withstand anything. So Patrick asked what the boss would do with her. Since she seemed to have potential, Swald said he would teach her to fight, and if that didn't work, he would let her live peacefully there. Patrick couldn't believe it and was anxious to know who would be responsible for teaching her. Swald said that the one responsible would be him, Patrick. He told him not to play hard to get, as he knew Patrick complained about being bored with nothing to do. Since she was a homunculus, she was likely very strong and likely harbored hatred for humans. Now Patrick wanted to know if she had a name. He tried to remember, as he thought he had heard it once. She muttered something. To Patrick's surprise, he hadn't expected that. She said slowly Lello without any context. Patrick asked if that was really her name, if there was nothing more. Swald said it didn't matter, but Patrick suggested the boss could give her another name. So he began to think of a name. He suggested naming her Renee. Patrick liked the suggestion, thinking her name could now be Renee Lello, but Swald was already asleep again. Patrick knelt down a bit to speak with her. They would start with the basics, and he taught her how to smile. Patrick hadn't expected her to smile in a situation like that. He wanted to know what his boss had done in Harston for things to have ended up like that, but Swald replied that there was always an exception in the life of a monster. Patrick asked what that exception was, but it was a long story, and on Swald's lap was the sleeping Mel's. Patrick joked that Swald must have kidnapped a child, but Swald would never do something so troublesome. The skeleton wanted to know where Renee was and why Swald had brought that child, and Swald began to explain. He said he had found her in a human village. Patrick fell silent for a moment. He wanted to know if she had been injured, but Swald said she only appeared tired, nothing more. Perhaps they had been limiting and restricting her life in that place. Patrick began to pace, confused by what he had just heard. He said that if she had been rejected, Swald could have just said so. There was no need to be so poetic about something simple. He teased that now Swald would have to dress like a maid and take care of the dungeon, but Patrick added that his resignation letter was always ready. However, he still wanted to know what his boss would do next, but Swald said there was nothing to do now. They just had to wait, as they didn't know when she would return to them. Patrick let out a dry laugh, understanding what had happened. It was best to leave his boss alone when he was like this. He could be a bit tough, but after a while, before Patrick could finish his thoughts, he saw something. He immediately called out to his boss. He said, "She's here," but Swald didn't quite understand who he meant. The person he had been waiting for the most had arrived. Reina asked if Swald had eaten, and if not, she would prepare something for him. Her eye was different, a different color. Patrick turned to Swald to ask. He wasn't sure if his boss had gone mad or had been sincere enough to give her one of his eyes. Swald explained that her eye had become useless, and if she could see better, she might have handled that monster more easily. As he had said before, she still had that heart, it didn't matter when. He just asked her to see properly, and next time to give him a true stone of love. Renee said that from now on, she would always be with Lord Swallow. Inside the cave, a stalactite dripped as if it were crying. A drop of water fell on Mel's head, waking her up. She wondered where she was as she couldn't remember what happened. Beside her, Patrick was sharpening a blade, which frightened her. Mel's thought she had died and that he was the Reaper, but the skeleton said this wasn't the place she imagined. They were in the center of the elders, and Mel's was extremely surprised by this statement. If this was truly the place, then he wasn't the Reaper but Patrick, who remarked how quick she was to figure things out. Leaving there, she said she didn't know when he would wake up again. Then she gave a strong kick, ordering her boss to wake up immediately. Swald slowly woke up, saying he had been having a good nap and realized that Mel's had woken up. Now everything made sense to her, and she could hardly believe who was standing before her. She bowed, saying he was the beast above all things, the great Lord Swallow. She apologized for her lack of manners and introduced herself as a descendant of Asmodeus Mel's of Linf, which he repeated simultaneously. She was confused, unsure of how he had learned her name. She thought Swald must have told him. She wanted to know where he was, recalling seeing him in the city when they recovered the decapitating blade. Swald explained that it was, in fact, him who had been there with her. But Mel's didn't understand what Lord Swallow had just said. Now he firmly declared that he, standing before her, was Swald. Mel's fell silent for a moment. Then her expression changed, perplexed. She was mortified, realizing she had been by his side without showing any respect. Patrick then changed the subject, bringing up what they had done with the humans. He couldn't believe his boss hadn't mentioned the part involving humans. Now Swald was embarrassed and found himself in a tricky situation. Patrick told him to follow, and Swald, with no other option, agreed. They were now in the forest near the city's border. A woman was walking through despite warnings not to. She remarked that the forest was full of herbs and mushrooms. A noise nearby put her on alert. It was a person, and they were badly injured. The woman approached to help, as she had many herbs with her. Before she could pick any, she was attacked, and was brutally devoured by the strange figure. Someone hooded was walking through the night. As they continued, they said they needed to go on. The dungeon was a battlefield, and to live there, one needed skills. Renee remarked that knowing how to be quiet was a basic rule in Lord Swallow's home, but Mel's didn't want to obey, claiming she was a free monster. She added that she had been there before Swald became a demon king and had come to speak with him. Renee asked her to be quiet as he was sleeping. Turning, Mel said that's why she needed Renee to keep Swald's body warm while he slept, and she mocked Renee, calling her a conservative auntie. That insult was more than Renee could bear, and she shouted for Mel's to call her that one more time. Now Renee was ready to give Mel's a wooden coat. She ordered her to come forward and receive her gift. Patrick was watching everything unfold. Swald complained that they were so noisy he couldn't sleep, but Patrick said Swald had no right to complain since it was his fault everything was a mess. Not understanding what was going on, Swald asked if it was really that bad. Patrick realized that Swald didn't read the reports he received. Due to the need to reinforce some of the defenses, the bordering villages were being attacked by monsters, and there was more. The Lord of Harston had killed himself, paralyzing the city. In the last 3 weeks, every news source had only reported 3 pieces of news about Harston. Patrick wanted to know if his boss understood what that meant, but Swald had no idea. Patrick became irritated, thinking his boss spoke without thinking and was about to hand in his resignation letter. However, Swald apologized multiple times. Swald wanted to know what Patrick thought of the situation, but lacking information, Patrick couldn't say for sure. Patrick believed that Harston might have been cut off from all communication with the outside world. Since Swald had destroyed the city, he should know the extent of the damage, but hearing no news from a village was definitely a bad sign. However, the center of the elders relied on that city, as through it they could gauge the size of the subjugation team and know when they would come. They needed to hurry and go to the city. If they waited too long, no one knew what might happen. Swald wished Patrick a good journey and told him not to stress too much, but hoped he would be called to go along as well. Patrick began to leave and mentioned that he would return as soon as possible, much to his boss's surprise. This made Swald happy because he could finally get some sleep and relax in peace. Before departing, Patrick noted that it might be difficult to go alone and that someone should accompany him. Swald quickly got up and looked at the girls who were fighting. Mel's was the first candidate, but she could end up destroying the entire village. That definitely wouldn't be good. Renee volunteered to go with Patrick, but she was an even worse option, so it was better that neither of them accompanied Patrick. Since Swald couldn't make a decision, the skeleton suggested that his boss accompany him on the journey instead. Swald realized he had fallen into Patrick's trap like a fish caught in a net, but it didn't take long for him to see a way out. Even though he was the best option, he couldn't change form because his bracelet had broken. The skeleton knew his boss couldn't go with him without that artifact. Swald was relieved now that he could rest in his lair sleeping and doing nothing. But he was already in human form, cursing his subordinate, wishing for a slow death for him. However, Patrick reminded him that he was already dead. Besides, Swald was the one who said he couldn't go without the bracelet. In other words, if he had the bracelet, he could go without any problem. Swald grumbled as he argued with the skeleton, saying that wasn't exactly what he meant. Soon they arrived in the town, and Patrick remarked that Swald had really put on a show when he destroyed it. As they entered, Patrick explained there were 4 ways to gauge how active a human village was. The first was by how crowded the market was, but there wasn't one there. The second was to see how much smoke came from the chimneys, but it was a bit too late for that now. The third was by the presence of mercenaries or the size of the subjugation team, but there was none of that either. Swald wished to leave soon. The last way was to go to the bar. Before Patrick could explain further, Swald had disappeared. He had rushed ahead, saying Patrick was taking too long, much to the skeleton's annoyance at his boss's drinking habits. They entered the bar, happily thinking they'd find something there. But inside, there was nothing. To Patrick, this was the worst possible scenario. The village was no longer functioning. A pile of bodies was stacked in a corner. A drop of rain fell on one of them. The rain began to fall harder, and some of the bodies started to move. Lightning lit up the sky, and someone remarked that they had all worked hard. After passing through Harston, they would head straight to the imperial capital, as humanity was weaker than ever after the Black Calamity. This was the perfect opportunity to destroy the empire. If the bar was empty, it meant things definitely weren't going well. It was as if the town was completely isolated. While they were there, someone asked who they were. The one who appeared was the bar owner. Nervously, he asked what had brought them to that place. The skeleton introduced himself as a knight from subjugation team, knowing the man was worried they might be thieves or bandits. He'd assured him they only wanted a meal and a place to sleep. After realizing they were customers, the man apologized. But he explained he didn't have any food fit for a knight, and in fact, nowhere in the town would they find any. Patrick asked if this was due to the Black Calamity, and seeing that he knew the reason, the man assumed he would be understanding. He apologized again, explaining that he didn't even have a room prepared. Patrick noted that in this situation, the price of water was higher than that of lodging. He tossed the man a coin, which left him stunned. It was a gold coin, and Patrick asked again why the room wasn't ready yet. Immediately, the man began to serve them, directing them to a room. However, he glanced at Swald suspiciously. He asked who the person following Patrick was. Patrick replied that Swald was his slave. But even as a slave, he was very useful, which was why he treated him well and allowed him to stay in the same room. Now the two were in the room, which was more comfortable than Swald had expected. He chose a bed and remarked that it was much better than the place he had stayed with Mel's. Patrick agreed that it was a very good room, and Swald asked if he couldn't have come up with something better than slave to tell the man. But with those clothes, it was the most appropriate. People would think he was a thief, so slave was a more fitting label. As a slave, it would avoid conflict since people would see him as someone's property, and since he wouldn't change clothes, it was the most practical solution. Patrick then asked if his boss didn't want to move as little as possible. Swald wholeheartedly agreed, saying that in his next life he wanted to be a rock. So he should listen to Patrick's advice now, as what he said was reasonable. Patrick went outside, hoping his boss could rest, but Swald advised him to take it easy on the first day. Patrick thought about that for a moment. He told his boss not to worry too much about him. From above, he could see the extent of the destruction in the city and thought about what might have caused it to crumble so thoroughly. He wondered who the current lord of the city was, as this had piqued his curiosity. Since the imperial family must be furious, it wouldn't be surprising if there was a change in the lord's family. So he headed directly to find out who this person was, making his way to the lord's manor. It was going to be difficult because the security there was better than he expected. There were still many guards keeping watch. Any aggressive interaction with them would only cause more alarm in the city, and that wouldn't be good. So it was wise not to rush into this. As he arrived, there was a spot he wanted to check as soon as possible. Humans couldn't sense it, but he could. That was definitely the smell of a corpse. He just didn't expect it to be there. Meanwhile, Swald lay in his bed thinking. As comfortable as it was, he could never sleep well in these places. The innkeeper knocked on the door, asking if the knight was there. Swald replied that his master had stepped out, but the man had prepared a meal for them. It wasn't good for an innkeeper to leave his guests hungry, and since they had paid so well, it was the least he could do. Since they hadn't been properly introduced, the innkeeper told Swald his name was Novin, and Swald introduced himself. Novin hoped the man wouldn't be too disappointed as there wasn't much food. He then asked if the situation in the city was truly that bad. Novin explained that the Black Calamity had indeed struck, and those who witnessed it almost went mad on the spot. Right after that, the city's lord had taken his own life. Following that, the flow of supplies to the city was cut off, and outside the city walls, you could see the bodies of those who had starved to death. Novin didn't know what they had come to do, but it was best to leave as soon as daylight broke. He added that Swald should know this well himself. What usually happens to people when they're backed into a corner? At the inn's window, a girl made her entrance. She had taken the opportunity to slip in through the window. Now inside the inn, she was pleased to have entered their room. They were outsiders and no doubt staying in the most expensive room of the inn despite knowing the village's dire situation. Clearly, they had a lot of money. She needed to grab whatever she could that could be traded for money. Looking at their clothes, she noticed they looked like rags and began to doubt if they really had any money. But she could use those rags. They were better than what she was wearing. Opening a chest, she found nothing of value inside. This wasn't good. She guessed they must have taken everything with them when they left. She kept searching through a few more drawers in the room. She found an object. Apparently, they hadn't taken everything, but she had no idea what it was. A noise approached the room. Patrick remarked that he had checked the Lord's manor and asked what his boss had done. Swald, referring to himself as master, said he had done what Patrick could see. Patrick wished he had seen the new Lord, but the security was too tight, so he had returned empty-handed. He asked if his boss had discovered anything, but Swald threw the question back at him, asking if he really expected that from him. Patrick replied that he was just being polite. It seemed they had been cut off from the outside world. Even the innkeeper didn't know much. Patrick was extremely surprised, almost in shock, that his boss had done something for a change. So that was it. They were cut off. As soon as the day broke, they would continue their search for information. Patrick mentioned they should keep the windows closed. When he had left, only one was open, but now both were, which could lead to them being robbed. Swald insisted he hadn't touched the windows. Patrick joked that it must have been a ghost. Swald replied that ghosts or not, someone had opened them, and it wasn't him. That's when it dawned on both of them. They began searching the room from top to bottom. Swald realized that his coat, made by Renee, was no longer there. Patrick's item had also disappeared, and he asked if his boss had seen what he had stored there. Swald had no idea what had been stolen from him. Patrick became worried because what had been taken was one of his ribs. The thief, Rosalina, was running through the streets of the city, hurrying. What she had managed to steal should be enough. Someone stopped her and called her by name, Rosalina. He wanted to know where she had been, wandering through the night like that. He had already warned her not to walk around the city alone at night, but she said it was for a good cause, for everyone's benefit. He reprimanded her, saying she shouldn't exhaust herself as it would only make her hungrier. She insisted that it was for a good reason. Another person approached, telling Toth not to be so harsh on her. This person was their leader, and he was now awake. Thieves shouldn't be afraid of the dark, he said, but going out at night without telling anyone was definitely not acceptable. She should be more considerate of the others, wandering around doing as she pleased. This place was different from the home that had welcomed her so warmly. She promised to be more careful, and the leader then asked what she was carrying. She asked him to wait a moment. Rosalina presented the items she had stolen, prompting the leader to ask if she had taken them from someone. She confirmed it, saying she had gotten them from the inn. She had taken them from the most expensive room, and they were well guarded, so it must be a valuable artifact. The leader put his hands on his head, trying to explain to her what it was. It was a person's rib. She was shocked, not realizing they were human bones. Toth asked if she had robbed a grave, but the leader said she wouldn't proudly present it if that were the case. That bone was likely from a degenerate hobby or used for magical rituals. He explained that the world was full of degenerates who mutilated slaves just to make exotic ornaments. If it belonged to someone who practiced necromancy, it was definitely dangerous. Also, those clothes she stole were strange, like something a beggar would wear. But the fabric used to make them was of high quality. It didn't take long for him to realize that she hadn't even checked the pockets of the clothes. Inside, there was a handful of gold coins, to everyone's surprise. However, he became apprehensive, knowing it wasn't the time to be happy about it. Still, Rosalina insisted that this time she had targeted the right place. Thinking to himself, the leader realized that guests staying in the most expensive room at the inn, possessing a human rib, wearing high-quality fabric, and carrying a bag full of gold coins were not the kind of people they should have messed with. Just then, Patrick and Swald appeared, saying they had come to take back what was stolen from them. They said they were expecting to see all of them. It seemed like everyone was safe. Patrick mentioned to his boss that those clothes were a gift from Ren. Just thinking about what might happen if those clothes were really stolen made him fear the girl's reaction. The leader of the thieves told his people to step back from the situation. Patrick asked if he was the leader but didn't get a response. He then wanted to know how they were found so quickly. The leader guessed that the item must have called for its owner. Swald only wanted to resolve the issue and get back to sleep. Patrick decided to let this one slide as his boss had spent the entire day walking around. Patrick then asked the thief if he wasn't going to return what he had stolen, even after being caught, but the thief argued that he had no guarantee it would be left in peace if he returned the items. He had a point, and the thief was intrigued, wondering how they had found them so quickly, even though Rosalina had left no traces. That would be impossible unless they were some kind of monster, or perhaps they were users of dark magic. He asked if they lived in the shadows, to which Patrick responded that it was pretty dark in their cave. Now the thief believed they were necromancers and asked if the item was important to them. Patrick replied that it was part of his body. The thief thought Patrick was treating the item as if it were a part of himself, but Patrick firmly clarified once again that it was indeed a part of him. Suddenly, the thief threw the rib high into the air. He ordered his group to flee quickly. Patrick rushed desperately to catch his rib. He managed to grab it just in time. However, standing beside him was someone ready to strike him on the head. The blow was delivered with great force, shattering the weapon as it collided with Patrick's helmet. The attacker realized that no damage had been inflicted. Despite everything happening, Swald only yawned sleepily. The weapon used to attack Patrick was a rock, which made Swald comment on how dire the situation must be in this place. Just then, someone approached to attack from behind. As soon as the blade touched Swald's body, it completely shattered. Before the attacker could flee, he was captured. Still holding the man, Swald turned to Patrick, calling him master, and asked what he should do with him. Patrick suggested they should knock all of them out. Swald corrected him, saying that wasn't quite what he meant, but they should give the same treatment to all of them. It didn't take long for Patrick to soften up the first troublemaker. Meanwhile, at a nearby table, the girls were talking, wondering if Swald was doing all right. It had only been half a day since they had left. Nothing dangerous should be happening to Swald, but Ren was uneasy, thinking her boss might not have eaten yet. Mel's reassured her, saying she was overthinking it, and that skipping a meal wasn't the end of the world. She reminded Ren that they were just in a human village, nothing more. Patrick returned, saying it had been more troublesome than he expected, and Swald was happy to have recovered his clothes. He just wished they had a map or some information and thought it was best to finish things up quickly. Turning back to Swald, Patrick noticed something he didn't like. Swald was lying on the ground, and the thief leader remarked that it was more comfortable than one might imagine. Nearby, the girl approached, apologizing for what she had done. She admitted that she was the one who had stolen their belongings and that the others had nothing to do with it. She was the only one to blame. Tough rushed to get her to flee, fearing they might still be hostile. Swald pointed out that they knew her intentions weren't exactly noble. He ordered Patrick to handle the situation, and Patrick moved toward her. Both the man and the girl were terrified now. She pulled out a knife, saying she would attack if he came any closer. Rosalina clutched a cross in her hand. For a brief moment, it was as if she became someone else. Patrick noticed something strange about the whole situation. The man attacked him, but it was futile. Patrick was already standing before the girl. He looked closely at her and the object in her hand. Patrick asked where she had gotten that cross. It was a rosary resembling an inverted cross with a phoenix, and it emitted mana. He recognized it as mana used for surveillance. The girl tried to explain that this wasn't something one would expect to find in the hands of someone from the outskirts. Patrick called out to his boss, who asked what was going on. Patrick explained that the people were being watched by someone. The moment the girl took hold of the item, it emitted mana. It seemed to activate under certain conditions. Patrick suggested that if they figure out the details, they could understand the intentions of the person who had set this up. Swald remarked that the sea wasn't known for its magic, and the whole situation was bizarre. Patrick wanted to get them to cooperate and asked for Swald's help, but Swald doubted Patrick would get anywhere. Patrick, however, was quite sharp and said he had a brilliant idea for this situation. He apologized to the thieves, explaining that it wasn't just the theft that had prompted their reaction. They had received orders from the royal family not to leave any trace of those they came into conflict with. He claimed they were part of a secret group directly serving the imperial family, the Rona Mist, Knights of the Shadows. The thieves had never heard of such a group before. Patrick assured them that he had no intention of causing harm now and that they could relax. They asked what the knight was doing there. Patrick explained that his mission was to save the city. That was his true purpose in the area. The only reason he was going against his orders was that he needed information they might have. He needed to assess the situation quickly to send reinforcements and supplies to the city. Patrick asked if they weren't interested in helping, as he also needed their assistance. Murmurs ran through the group of thieves as they discussed what the knight had just said. They ultimately decided to help the knight. The persuasion had worked, and Patrick remarked that it was easy to handle people in situations like this. Swald, however, wanted to know if they could go back already. However, they needed to stay longer. Patrick was uncovering more loose ends in the situation. Swald noticed that Patrick was excited, but it only made things more tedious for him. Now Swald understood what people meant by keeping an eye on the enemies around you, but Patrick didn't quite get that comment. Patrick asked him to get up, saying that given how things were going, Swald would need to do some work too. Swald grumbled, accusing Patrick of being too enthusiastic and asking if he couldn't handle things on his own. Patrick was disappointed by this. Patrick planned to keep an eye on the captain, who seemed the most suspicious of them all, while Swald would blend in with the others. Swald didn't expect to have to stay so close to people, but they had no choice. Between the knight and the slave, only one of them would have an easier time blending in with the common folk. Patrick urged him to try to blend in, mimicking their behaviors. Swald resisted, complaining that he didn't want to imitate humans. He remarked that they spent most of the day sleeping and the rest of it being tired, going through their lives without much motivation. He realized he just needed to keep doing what he always did. They had to investigate the religion that gave out the rosary, and the faster they gathered the information, the quicker they could return home. He reminded himself to maintain composure, even though humans could be quite rude. People began asking questions about the knight's secret origins. They assumed he must come from a place with abundant food. The constant chatter was overwhelming, and Swald found it unbearable. He didn't know how to get closer to them, feeling suffocated by their presence. If he had the choice, he would have devoured them without hesitation. But he remembered he needed to be friendly, so he started talking to a child. The boy asked if he had seen the heroes in person, but Swall didn't know who they were, although the name sounded familiar. Meanwhile, the girl who had stolen from them approached him. She apologized again for taking their belongings. Swall shrugged it off, saying it was fine since he had them back now. Toth, standing nearby, explained that he was temporarily replacing the captain and had been ordered to carry out Swall's wishes. Toph asked if Swall was truly there to save Harston, and Swall confirmed. Toph then suggested that if Swall wanted to know how the village really was, he should see it with his own eyes. He offered to guide Swall, even though Swall didn't want to go along with it or understand why it was suddenly necessary. But staying meant more questions from the people, so he agreed to follow Toph's lead. They headed to the residential area first, and Swall asked where all the people were. Toph said Swall would know once he opened the door. Toph placed his hand on the door and pushed it open. Inside were only bodies of those who had succumbed to starvation. In that place, even theft wasn't an option because there was simply no food, and they didn't know how much longer they could endure without it. Swall wanted to know one thing. When there is famine, the people's anger is usually directed at the town's lord. He wondered why the people there had revolted despite their hunger. Toph explained that it had been about a month since the Black Disaster hit the city. He wondered why the city remained calm, why its people hadn't revolted yet. Toph asked if Swall wasn't curious about this. Meanwhile, back at the dungeon, Mel's and Ren were sitting at a table. Mel's mentioned how boring it was to stay there without anything to do and that she wished she had gone with them. Ren reassured her, saying Swall had left for the good of everyone, and that was noble of him. It was a demonstration of his trust in them to leave him alone, but Ren believed he trusted her more than he did Mel's. Mel stood up, realizing she should have noticed that sooner. Ren told her to stay focused, as they never knew when humans might try to invade the dungeon. Mel said she was always keeping an eye on things and had just checked the place 10 minutes ago, using her magic to observe. While they were talking, Mel's noticed something strange. Her magic reacted, someone had entered the dungeon. Since it wasn't an intense reaction, it was likely only one person. Ren stood up and told Mel's to prepare as well. The liquid in their cups began to ripple. Whoever the intruder was, they were already approaching. With calm steps, the intruder asked why they were in such a frenzy. It was an unexpected visit, and Mel's wondered why Renee was reacting the way she was. The intruder, Bathory, asked if Renee had been well since they last saw each other. Renee began to apologize, saying she hadn't known about the visit, otherwise she would have prepared something better for Bathory. But Bathory told her not to worry, as she had come unannounced. However, if Renee really wanted to do something, she could give Bathory some tomato juice, but Renee quickly replied that it was out of reach. Hearing that, Bathory could only lament. She then looked at Mel's, curious about the new person in the dungeon. Mel's proudly introduced herself, saying she was a demon king and a descendant of Asmodeus. Renee introduced Bathory as well, explaining that she was the ruler of the castle of Chait. Bathory commented that the young demon king had an interesting aura. Hearing all this, Mel's discreetly asked if she was destined to meet every dungeon lord if she stayed there forever. Renee didn't like the forever part and commented that her colleague was quite the comedian. However, Bathory overheard and asked if Mel's didn't yet belong to the dungeon, and Mel's confirmed that she didn't. A servant of Bathory appeared to attend to her, and Bathory inquired about where Patrick and that other annoying person were. She was soon informed that both had left the dungeon, much to her surprise. Bathory hadn't expected them to leave during such troubling times. Her unexpected reaction prompted Renee to ask if something had happened. Bathory explained that the villagers near her castle had all been wiped out. However, there were no bodies left at the site. She didn't believe it was the work of human hands, as the tomato juice seemed to flow to one location as if the path had been carved out. At the end of that path lay the city of Haston, and Bathory was intrigued by the situation. Hearing about the missing bodies, Mel suggested it might have been the work of the undead. However, Bathory disagreed, explaining that if that were the case, not many beings would be capable of such an act. Most of the undead lack intelligence, and those that do are called elders, holding a higher title than the rest. If an undead army is moving in unison, someone must be controlling them. The Lord of the Undead, King Erebos the Immortal, was one possible suspect that came to Bathory's mind. Upon hearing that name, Mel's became a bit uneasy. Although Bathory had no evidence, she had come to the dungeon to speak with Swald and asked if there were any messenger monsters available in the dungeon. Renee responded that they currently had none. There was no way to communicate, but Renee firmly believed in her leader. Bathory noticed this determination and felt pity for the girl. Bathory hoped that Patrick would have something helpful to share, as they didn't have much they could do to establish communication with him at the moment. But Mel's was excited, thinking her time to shine had come. Meanwhile, Toph was explaining to Swald that after the Black Disaster, someone had set fire to the city's fields. With the fields lost, all of the crops were destroyed, and soon after, rumors spread among the people that whatever remained after the disaster had been contaminated. The people began to believe the land was cursed, and that they had been abandoned by the emperor, falling into despair. Despite that, some still held on to hope. A wealthy commoner couple began helping the people. They had seeds that weren't contaminated, and they shared them with the townsfolk. But just when hope was rising again, something happened. The couple was found dead in their home, perhaps killed by some greedy person, and once again, hope vanished from the city. Without hope, there was no cooperation among the people. Those in the outskirts had survived so far only because of the rumors that the seeds were contaminated. They had eaten them and suffered no consequences. Swald realized that without his involvement, the seeds wouldn't have been contaminated. Someone had spread a false rumor. It was time for them to move to the next location. There, some guards were protecting the entrance. At first, they believed they could overcome this situation easily, and the pile of bodies nearby was the result of that false belief. To avoid attracting insects in the streets, they dug holes and piled up the bodies like that. Swald asked why they hadn't burned them. Toth explained that the mourning was still too strong. It was a delicate situation for the survivors. Toth then revealed that the couple who had helped the city had a daughter. Rosalina was their daughter, and her parents were somewhere in that pile of bodies. Understanding this, Swald gained a clearer picture of the situation. He asked if the guards were always stationed there, and it became clear that they weren't protecting anything. They were controlling it. Guards stationed at the gate like that had to be following the orders of the Lord, which made this person even more suspicious. Meanwhile, Patrick was on top of a building. The best approach in this situation was to deal with the guards directly, since they needed to uncover their plans. That's why Patrick had stolen a harpy egg to create a major distraction. He marveled at his brilliant plan, massaging his own ego, telling himself how clever he was. At first, that was his plan. But the only problem was that he hadn't expected so many of them to come. Up on the rooftop, he sighed. Meanwhile, the sky was filled with harpies. Inside a nearby house, a woman was confronted with something she didn't want to see. Her brother had hung himself by the neck. From his mouth came morbid words telling her she needed to stay alive. The woman woke up startled. It had all been just a nightmare. Sweating in distress, she brought her hand to her head, trying to regain her composure. Upon hearing all this, the servant asked her lady if she had experienced another nightmare. But the lady, Larissa the Lord of Harston, said she was fine. Seeing her stand up, the servant asked if she wasn't going to continue resting, but Larissa said she needed some fresh air. It had only been a few weeks since she became the Lord, but she vividly remembered the day her brother passed away. Her family had abandoned the place, and she knew there was only one way for her to overcome the situation. She needed to revive the city at all costs. Speaking now to a mysterious figure, she demanded that he fulfill his promise, as he had promised salvation for them. He had said he would protect her and the territory as well. The figure confirmed that's exactly what he had said. She was furious, asking him to look out the window and tell her if what he saw was salvation. However, the figure responded that he hadn't gone against his word, assuring her that she shouldn't worry and that soon the city would be saved. Laura Sinivier thought he was never clear in his words, but there was nothing she could do except trust him. The man insisted that everything was progressing smoothly and she should continue living comfortably in the meantime. Soon, all of her problems would disappear. Sitting down, she acknowledged his words, saying she understood and would trust him and wait a little longer. At that moment, someone entered the hall with a message about the territory's security. Several harpies had gathered at the northern gate, and a lone knight had dealt with them all. She wanted to know who he was and whom he served. The gatekeeper had asked the same, but the knight remained silent. Laura Sinivier decided she wanted to meet him, and the servant said she would bring him to the castle. The man before her urged caution, suggesting the knight could be an assassin in disguise. But despite the suspicions, Laura Sinivier felt his actions deserved gratitude, and as the Lord, she had to offer it. She ordered the knight to be brought before her. Meanwhile, Patrick finally met with Laura Sinivier and thanked her for receiving him. He expressed how difficult and exhausting the journey to the city had been, but standing before her made him feel his efforts were rewarded. She acknowledged his hard work in protecting the city, and on behalf of all the citizens, expressed her gratitude. Patrick thanked her, but he could tell from her demeanor that she lacked experience and suspected she was the younger sister of the previous lord. It wasn't long before she asked whom he served. A heavy silence filled the room. Seeing that he wouldn't respond, she asked for his name. Patrick explained that he was in a position where he couldn't reveal such details and hoped for her understanding. All these secrets made her curious, and she asked if he would remove his helmet if she requested it. Patrick explained that his face was marked with scars and that half of it was missing skin, but if she truly wanted to see, he would oblige. However, if he was hiding his face for that reason, she wouldn't force him, and although the city had little to offer, she still wanted to pay him. She asked what he desired. Patrick asked for food, knowing it was the most valuable item in the city at the moment. Depending on her answer, he might learn more about her. Without hesitation, Laura Sinivier agreed, to which Patrick promptly thanked her. Now he thought that given her quick response, there might be plenty of food in the castle. If that were the case, why had she allowed the city to fall into such misery? Additionally, he could sense something strange about the man standing with her. Being undead, Patrick felt a kind of familial bond between them. Patrick said he had one more question. There was something that had been bothering him from the start. He asked the man what he was and who he served. The figure remained silent. Elsewhere, Patrick was recounting the events to Swald. Swald asked if the Lord had let him leave easily after such a direct question, and Patrick admitted he had asked out of pure curiosity. Even though he sensed a connection between them, Swald asked why Patrick hadn't done anything. Patrick explained that he couldn't fight there and he wasn't certain of the man's nature. Depending on the situation, human necromancers could give off the same energy. Swald joked that he would have just punched him, but Patrick reminded him they were there to solve the problem he had caused, not to create more complications. Swald apologized. Patrick then asked if Swald had discovered anything, to which Swald replied that the people hadn't eaten the grains, believing they were contaminated and they were starving. He also mentioned that Rosalina kept running away, making it hard to talk to her. Patrick commented that it would have been helpful if they had some kind of mind control magic, suggesting that Mel's would be useful in that case. Swald, frustrated, complained about being dragged along and having to listen to that. Patrick then presented the food he had received from the Lord in a bag. Swald thought it was for eating, but Patrick wanted to use it as a way to get closer to Rosalina. Swald stood before Rosalina, who looked visibly frightened. He asked her why she was so tense and offered her some food, suggesting they share it. She hesitated at first, but was clearly hungry. She recognized the biscuit as something made by the priest, and her face lit up as she received it. Swald asked who this priest was. Rosalina seemed delighted that she had found someone who shared her faith, as in her circle, she was the only believer. To her, not believing was foolish. All one needed was faith to be saved. She asked if Swald agreed, to which he replied uncomfortably, yes. After much walking, they finally arrived at the place she had been leading him to. For some reason, it always felt strange arriving there. Torches lit the way, though the path was still dark, so Rosalina advised Swald to be careful with his steps. The priest began to speak, saying that Calamity had come to punish sins, and that among them was an omnipotent being capable of solving everything. As his devoted followers, they were to be revered for being chosen. The congregation agreed, and Rosalina asked Swald to sit down. During the sermon, the priest reminded them not to forget the divine word, and that they would eat the blessings provided by this figure. To Swald, it all seemed like brainwashing. Suddenly, everyone stood up. Rosalina mentioned that they had arrived just in time for the Eucharist. This was when the priest offered them the biscuits, the same kind that Patrick had received from the Lord. Swald wondered why those biscuits were also in the castle. Rosalina whispered to Swald, saying that whoever believed in the priest would receive eternal life and happiness, and for those who were close to him, they would receive an even greater blessing. Swald asked what this greater blessing was, but Rosalina couldn't say for sure. While they were talking, the priest approached her, giving her another biscuit, her blessing for the day, which she gratefully accepted. He offered one to Swald as well, noting that he hadn't seen him before but hoped he would return. Taking the biscuit, Swald said he would think about it. Sensing suspicious energy, Swald asked what the meaning of all this was. The priest immediately became nervous, realizing that Swald was onto something. Swald stated that humans couldn't see mana, but he could clearly see through the priest's tricks. Approaching the priest, Swald declared that he didn't care what he did with the humans. During the sermon, Swald had seen the flow of mana spread throughout the place. He finished by warning the priest not to keep investigating him. The priest realized then that Swald wasn't human. the Lord's castle. Still, it was only a supposition without absolute certainty. Patrick had already taken charge of the situation, and Swald asked if Mel's was too busy. She replied that she wasn't, so he invited her to accompany him to the castle. It was time, he said confidently, to replace one of the malevolences in the dungeon. Surprised, Mel's agreed. The moonlight illuminated the area outside the castle. As the knight had expected, this was indeed the most suspicious place. The smell of corpses was even stronger here. The underground area was useless in this situation. Soon, Swald began hearing strange noises from within. As he moved forward, he came across something, a large zombie handling corpses, explaining the foul stench. It had been a long time since Swald had encountered such a being. Interrupting the creature, Swald apologized for doing so and asked who its master was. The zombie turned to face him, but said nothing in response before attacking. It was a blow befitting its size, but it was so slow that it would never land. Swald blocked the strike, using only his fingers. Even with both hands, the zombie's strength was pitiful. For such a creature to be in the castle, Swald wondered if the Lord was involved. While breaking the zombie's axe with his fingers, Swald decided that secrecy was no longer necessary, as they now had confirmation of everything going on. With one swift motion, he ended the abominable creature's existence. The flame's glow changed color as he muttered about how filthy the place was. Suddenly, something approached from behind. His helmet went flying, having been struck. Swald hadn't expected this and was slightly surprised. Standing before him was a Dullahan, and Swald wanted to know what preparations were underway. Patrick tried speaking with the monster, but it was in vain. He asked who had ordered the Dullahan to protect the place, but the creature remained silent. It wasn't long before the Dullahan struck Patrick with his sword, but Patrick managed to defend himself. The weapon in his enemy's hands was a cursed sword, making it a difficult opponent as the blade corroded any weapon it touched. Though Patrick's opponent wielded the sword, its power was much greater than the wielder's own. Nevertheless, Patrick tried to be diplomatic, attempting to communicate undead to undead. However, there was no dialogue. Both were intelligent, and Patrick understood that this silence indicated something more significant. The lord of the place must have all the answers. Placing his hand on the ground, Patrick invoked a spell. It caused his enemy to slip and lose contact with the ground, giving Patrick enough time to grab what remained of his sword from the floor. His adversary prepared for another strike. Using reinforcement magic on the sword stump, Patrick managed to sever the Dullahan's head from its body. Patrick only took action because the creature refused to engage in dialogue. Now he intended to finish the job in the blink of an eye. The monster realized it was in serious trouble. Patrick claimed the cursed sword for himself, remarking that the creature no longer seemed to need it. With a single swift movement, Patrick sliced the monster into pieces, leaving its body fragmented like a vacant lot. Inside the castle, the Lord Lerasiniviere was awake. She got out of bed, shivering from the cold. From the shadows, a voice asked if she had slept well. Turning to see who it was, she found Patrick cloaked in the shadows. She screamed in fear, startled that he had entered her chambers in the dead of night. But Patrick coldly stated that it was obvious he had urgent matters to discuss with her. He asked if her name was Lala. Pointing his sword at her, he warned that she had only 5 minutes, no more, to summon the man who had been with her earlier. With everyone gathered, Patrick apologized for summoning them at such an hour, but he said he had come across something interesting during his nighttime walk. He threw a head onto the center table. Lerasiniviere, confused, didn't recognize what it was, but Patrick wasn't convinced by her ignorance. It was the helmet of a Dullahan. Getting straight to the point, Patrick demanded to know why she was associated with the undead. Still bewildered, she asked what he was insinuating. Patrick pressed further, accusing her of pretending not to know anything. If she wasn't in control, then surely she had no idea what was happening in her own castle. The man beside Lerasiniviere urged her to call the guards and ignore Patrick's accusations, but Patrick nonchalantly mentioned that he had already dealt with the Dullahan in the basement. Now everyone was shocked by this revelation. The Lord hadn't imagined something like that existed beneath the castle. Moreover, there was a pile of bodies down there, and Patrick gave her another hint. The man standing next to her was also an undead. Lerasiniviere refused to believe Patrick's accusations, claiming that there wasn't enough evidence. Besides, the man had promised her that he would save Harston. To accuse him would put the future of the city at risk, and she couldn't accept that. Patrick questioned whether she truly understood who was endangering the city. Overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information, Lerasiniviere was at a loss for words. The man tried to calm with parties, noting that Dullahans were rare and not easily found. Patrick acknowledged this, admitting that he hadn't expected to encounter one and that something about the Dullahan had seemed off. The creature didn't speak during the battle, despite having intelligence, and its movements were unusual. After burning its soul, Patrick had investigated further. Inside its armor, there was something that had been controlling its mind, along with the name of the armor's original owner, Masham. Masham had been the vice captain of the Harder Brothers assault force, who led an attack on the undead 30 years ago. He was said to have been a powerful knight, but he disappeared after the assault. The question was, who were the undead that they had tried to fight back then? Raising his sword, Patrick said he would now ask his question differently. This time he wanted a direct answer. Where was their master, Arevos? Lerasiniviere, still confused by the entire interaction, couldn't comprehend what was happening. To her, Erebos was just the name of a monster guarding a dungeon. The man accused by Patrick began to laugh uncontrollably. Laricinivier, shocked, couldn't understand why he was laughing. Turning to him, she demanded to know if everything he had promised her about saving the territory had been a lie. Finally, the man admitted that it had all been a deception. The plan might change now, but there was nothing she could do about it. A peaceful resolution was no longer an option. He extended his hand, preparing to finish her off. But before he could act, Patrick swiftly severed his hand from his arm. Patrick was in control of the situation, warning them both to calm down or things would get chaotic. The now one-handed man showed no reaction to the loss of his limb. However, Laricinivier realized then that he was indeed undead. Removing his hood, the man introduced himself as Yuhumo and declared that he would slaughter everyone there. They should feel honored to join the ranks of the undead, as it was all part of a much larger plan. The plan of his master, Erebos, the Lord of all Deaths. Hearing this, Patrick questioned why the undead usually won their battles through sheer numbers. He hadn't expected such a stealthy and well-orchestrated invasion. Yuhumo complimented Patrick's accomplishments, admitting that he hadn't expected him to defeat Masham. It was the first time Patrick had been praised for defeating someone's minion. Yuhumo was now more curious about Patrick, a fellow undead knight, yet one who didn't serve Lord Erebos. Laricinivier, still stunned, hadn't seen any of this coming. The knight who saved Laricinivier was, in fact, undead himself. They needed a lord who would cooperate and protect the land, and Patrick wasn't keen on giving her a wooden coat as a gift. He mentioned that his mood had soured, and someone would have to pay the price. Once again, he severed another hand from the lich's body. Patrick wasn't playing around. He warned that it would be wise for the lich to obey, as he had little patience left. The lich retorted that threats wouldn't work on him, but Patrick countered that they had much to lose in this situation. Patrick hinted that the person accompanying him was far stronger than the lich imagined, strong enough to easily ruin all his plans. The lich acknowledged that humans would also be caught in the process. Patrick reminded him that he wasn't on the side of humans and urged the lich to spill everything before he lost his temper further. He also demanded to know what Erebos was planning. Under this pressure, the lich agreed to reveal what he knew. He started by asking Patrick if he knew how an elder was created. Patrick cut him off, ordering him to stop with the questions and get to the point. In the case of a human or elf, creating an elder required a massive amount of hatred. They were called elders because they could single-handedly deal with 1,000 zombies without assistance from anyone or anything. Erebos was powerful enough to create these elders with just his magic. The reason they isolated Harston and established a religion was to create more elders. They needed humans with living bodies but weakened souls. It was the perfect place to gather the undead, and the isolation had weakened the resolve of the people. The same went for the creation of the religion. Patrick understood that, but he pressed the lich on why there were so many bodies, to which the lich explained that it was to create even more elders. Their ultimate goal was to destroy the Empire. Patrick commented that this was not a pleasant plan. If the Empire fell and everyone became zombies, Erebos' next target would be the 7 great evil dungeons. As Patrick pieced it together, the lich cast a spell in front of him. A large magic circle appeared beneath them. Laricinivier tried to flee from the shadows that emerged. The lich taunted Patrick, saying he was a fool if he thought the lich couldn't cast magic without his hands. He also scoffed at Patrick's belief that he would tell him the truth. Furthermore, there was no being capable of standing against Lord Erebos. The only one who could have done anything was the ancient monster, who retreated for long periods every time it took action. And now nothing could stop his master's plans. If that was true, Patrick said, he had just one more question for the lich. The lich couldn't believe it as Patrick began breaking the magical bindings with just his strength alone. From everything Patrick had heard, it didn't matter how grand the lich's plans were. If the ancient monster appeared, all those plans would crumble. To the lich, this suggestion was absurd. To his surprise, rocks began falling from above. From outside, smoke and debris filled the air. Patrick could hardly believe what he was seeing. It was perfect timing. Swald had just arrived. Laricinivier coughed as dust filled the room. She heard someone complaining about hitting their head. It was Mel's, grumbling that the building was far too fragile. Patrick, with his usual sarcasm, commented that Mel's had impeccable timing. Swald asked Patrick what he had discovered, and the skeleton replied that he now knew everything. It didn't take long for Swald to spot Laricinivier, who was still standing there. As he glanced upward, distracted, a red energy spear was hurled at him. But Swald deflected it as if swatting a fly. From the rubble, someone started to rise, much to Mel's surprise, who hadn't expected the commotion. Swald, however, had no intention of standing idle and used his shadow to bind the rising figure. The lich was now impaled by spikes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He recognized this power. Patrick reminded the lich of what he had said about his companion being far stronger than expected. Swald, casually observing, asked what all of this was about while the lich grew increasingly terrified. Standing before the ancient monster, the lich couldn't even muster a response. He couldn't sense the crystal's energy from the upper floor anymore, and based on the energy from Mel's, he knew she was a demon lord. He realized he needed to buy as much time as possible and inform Lord Erebos of everything. The lich nervously asked what the ancient monster was doing in a place like this. He had assumed the monster would be hiding after the destruction in the city. Before he could finish speaking, something struck him. Outside the castle, debris flew everywhere. The Lich lay on the ground, wounded after that strike, and declared that they had all arrived too late. Mels cast a spell while commenting that the Lich talked too much. Meanwhile, Swald yawned, feeling incredibly sleepy. He noticed that the Lich was smiling, remarkably resilient even while being consumed by Mel's magic. As the Lich was engulfed, he declared that they should worship Arevos, for he had finally descended upon the land. Patrick rushed to inform Swald, but Swald, already aware of the situation, remarked that Arevos' entrance was unnecessarily dramatic. Outside, the residents noticed the sky growing darker and began looking up. People in the city started to run in panic. Rosalina was among them, moving quickly through the streets. Someone called her name, causing her to turn. It was Thought, awake and asking her the same. She explained that she had gone for a walk to clear her mind and had ventured to Jarbet Plaza. Immediately, she regretted mentioning it, knowing that nobody went there because of the pollution. She apologized, expecting him to be angry with her. Rosalina stood in silence, bracing for reprimand. To her surprise, That said nothing, simply asking if she had truly gone there. The captain had gathered everyone, reaching a decision. They would abandon the city at the next nightfall. Thought wasn't sure what she thought about the decision, but he shared that the captain didn't trust those knights. He urged her to follow him, promising to explain everything along the way. Soon, the two stood before a pile of bodies. Buried within that pile were the remains of Rosalina's parents. Dot told her that once they left, it would be a long time before they could return. However, the choice to stay or go was hers, and she should do what she thought was best. Rosalina confessed that she didn't fully understand why the captain wanted to abandon the city. She had believed the place could still be saved. Thought made no effort to convince her, admitting they didn't know what would happen. He acknowledged that she held onto her faith. She pondered this, reflecting on how it wasn't just God who saved people, but their actions as well. Thinking deeply, she realized that her own actions might bring salvation. With her hands clenched tightly, she stared at the pile of corpses and agreed with Thought. He watched her with patience. Handing her a torch, he asked if she was truly ready to do this. She responded that she was. Now with the torch in hand, she looked at the bodies. It took her some time to make a move. As she extended the torch toward the pile, a hand suddenly stopped her. A man, wondering who would visit such a place so late at night, interrupted her. Thought didn't know who he was. The man asked Rosalina what she was doing in a place like that. It was the pastor of her church. The pastor's interference surprised Rosalina. She tried to pull her hand away, but he held onto her tightly. The flames from the torch licked his arm. Thought urged him to let go of Rosalina. Soon they both caught a whiff of the stench coming from the pastor's body. Rosalina told him he should put out the fire quickly. The pastor suddenly flung her aside. Before she could hit the ground, Thought caught her, but the force of the throw sent both of them tumbling. Now Thought stared at the pastor with growing suspicion. The pastor's body began to change as it was engulfed in flames. Before their eyes, he revealed his true form as an undead. Both Rosalina and Thought were terrified by this sudden revelation. The undead pastor warned them to stay quiet, for his master was descending from the heavens. Their shock only grew as the pile of corpses around them began to stir. The eyes of the dead started glowing with a macabre scarlet hue. Rosalina could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Soon, the corpses began to move and walk. Thought urged her to run. The first thing they needed to do was escape immediately, as the zombies were already pursuing them. They managed to find shelter in a nearby house. They shoved all the furniture inside against the door, forming a small barricade that would buy them some time. Rosalina collapsed to the ground, saying she wasn't sure she could move anymore. However, Thought reminded her that they had no choice. It wasn't safe outside, and they needed to get to the next floor. She told him that her legs were paralyzed. He insisted that she climb onto his back as they needed to leave immediately. With Rosalina on his back, Thought ascended the stairs. Rosalina thanks him, knowing that he's also weakened. Through the window, they can see what is happening in the city's streets. Faced with this, Thought is uncertain if they will survive. Doubt begins to creep into his mind. Rosalina notices that he is deep in thought. The place reeks of decay, likely from whatever is inside. Thought draws his blade and strikes. Rosalina covers her eyes, not wanting to witness it, but slowly she begins to open them. Thought tells her that her amulet has bothered him for some time. She needs to start believing in other things, and he removes her amulet. As soon as he takes it off, they hear a loud noise coming from downstairs. The undead are entering the house, and Thought doesn't know what to do. Rosalina says she needs to find something to use as a weapon, but she watches as Thought steps away, leaving her feeling anxious. He begins descending the stairs. Before leaving, he offers a small smile to the girl. Rosalina is worried about her friend. She tries to get up to stop him, but as he leaves, he locks the doors, leaving Rosalina alone. He ties the doors shut from the outside. He placed a dirty cloth nearby to mask her scent. Inside, she screams, begging him not to abandon her, as fear overwhelms her. But he tells her she can't rely on others and must learn to fend for herself. The zombies are already climbing the stairs. He instructs her not to make any noise, no matter what she hears. She shouldn't make a sound or move without thinking of the consequences. Rosalina covers her mouth with her hand. For him, it was better that he sacrifice himself rather than them both perishing together. Before him stood several zombies. Seeing the human, they lunge to attack. He prepares his spear, ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. As he charges forward, he regrets being so hard on the girl. Rosalina, locked in the room, is helpless to stop it. She silently cries, knowing the fate that awaits Thought outside. The sky above the city now has a crimson hue. The zombies are gathered at the house. Thought couldn't withstand the assault and perished. The windows are now shattered. Outside, the priest hovers above the hordes of undead that flood the streets. He raises his hand toward the sky, ordering the undead to attack everything in sight. The citizens, armed, start blaming the city's lord for everything. As they march toward the castle, the red light intensifies. They believe it is a sign from the heavens, angry with the city's lord. As they advance, some begin to scream in terror. The crowd pauses to see what's happening, and they find an injured young man. He tells them that what's approaching is extremely dangerous. Someone rushes to help him, offering aid for his wounds. The person aiding him is a young apprentice from the city's magic tower, though just a beginner. As the apprentice tends to him, the young man says they're being attacked by the undead. He doesn't seem to be bleeding. The blood belongs to someone else. One of the men declares that the undead are closing in. The apprentice continues healing the young man's injuries, but the young man shouts in desperation, warning them that the undead are coming. The horde of zombies closes in rapidly on their position. The armed citizens realize what's heading their way. The first zombie appears, startling those nearby. Its eyes gleam with a grim glow. It tries to attack the nearest person. Before it can, a knight on horseback intervenes and strikes the zombie down. The knight tells the crowd that the zombies aren't as strong as they seem. Now they must choose, flee or stay and fight together. The crowd decides to stay and fight. The apprentices from the magic tower step forward, explaining that they were out of the city when the catastrophe occurred. Soon, more people begin volunteering. Hands rise from the crowd one after another. Seeing this, the knight declares that this is excellent. The strongest should take the front line, while the rest should form a perimeter. The sound of the zombies' approach can already be heard. The knight warns everyone that the undead are near. Numerous zombies are drawn closer to the living. The apprentices are readying their spells for battle. The knight commands them to launch their attack on the mass of zombies. A massive explosion erupts. Meanwhile, the captain still doesn't know what's happening. He is worried about Thought and Rosalina, as no one knows their whereabouts. Around a corner, he spots Rosalina sitting. He rushes to her aid. Calling her name, she slowly begins to wake. Worried, he asks what happened to her. She said that Oz saved her, but she spoke so weakly and he didn't understand. She said that he told her to stay quiet, but she ended up escaping. And because of her, Thought did what he did. The captain understands what she meant by that, and he misses the young man. He told her that he certainly isn't resentful of what she did. And it's not because of her that he perished, but because of him that she is still alive. She says that those aren't common undead. They needed help. The captain asks her to explain better what she just said. Rosalina is categorical, saying that they need the help of those knights. Of those two mysterious people who appear there suddenly, the captain says they are probably at the Lord's castle. Pulling out a potion, he told her she should take it and go to the castle. It would be much safer for her to be inside than to continue in the zombie-infested streets. He can't let her fight, not after Toth's sacrifice. He told her to find the knights for help, while he stayed there with the people to hold back the undead. Inside the castle, Patrick is impressed. The city is really a mess. Swald should take a look at how things are going. But he doesn't want to because it has nothing to do with him, to which Patrick says they are directly related to it. He can't say whether the humans have the upper hand, as Swald is only worried about how long this will last. But they don't have much time. It's only a matter of time before the humans get tired and are subdued by the undead. Swald is now more aware of the situation. And from the Lich's words, there must be another elder among the common zombies. It was time for them to return the favor to Erebos. But there's something they need to do before that. Patrick says whatever he's planning to do, he shouldn't. But Swald says it was Patrick who said the boss needed to work. The Lord is still there, looking anxiously at the monsters. Swald approaches her, asking what her name is. Stuttering, she says her name is Lala Sinivier. He introduces himself to her and says he is the Devourer. Placing one of his hands on her face, he leans closer. Looking into her eyes, he asks if she wants to live. Patrick tells him not to do this because she needs to be undead anyway. In fact, he wanted to do that, but he ended up changing his mind, though Patrick doesn't understand because he thinks the city is beyond saving. But he said they would only give up because of the undead, and the skeleton agrees. However, if they took care of them and if the Lord cooperated, there's no reason to give up on the city. He said this while still holding her. Patrick was prepared to hear something absurd, but it made a lot of sense. Using the Lord was very interesting to them. But humans are gossipers, and she might say something, though Swald knows not all of them are like that. He thinks this woman has a reason to keep living. Even knowing what he is now, she didn't stop looking at him. Really, for an ordinary human, that's admirable. All the heroes he's encountered so far had something special. Maybe she does too. And she's still sane even after seeing him, and she confirms that she has a reason to keep living. And considering this, she wouldn't do anything foolish. Patrick thinks that justification is risky, but Swald says he has a gut feeling about this, which made Patrick even more furious. But there's nothing he can do now that his boss is determined. However, if things got out of control, he would have to handle everything. Swald said he'd consider it. Swald says for him to intervene, she needs to ask him to save them, and she wants to know what will happen after that. He says the zombies will be wiped out and that Patrick will do his best to help them. Patrick was irritated when he realized he was being used as a bargaining chip. Now she wants to know what she'll need to do in return, and he plans for it to be something simple. She will have to offer everything she has to him. Offer everything to them, that's the deal. The situation is not ideal. If she refuses, she'll be killed either by them or by the zombies. But if she accepts, she'll live, though she'll end up losing everything she has. She thinks about the possible consequences of her choice. Patrick is already impatient and thinking about finishing her off. Footsteps are heard by Swald. Looking at the door, he said that someone is approaching where they are. Mel says he can block the door with magic, but Swald said there's no need to let the door be opened. She understood the message and prepared herself in case it was someone hostile. But the one who enters the hall is Rosalina. She is happy to have found him and asks the knight to help them. She said the city is overrun by zombies and that without his help, they won't be able to resist. Thought had already perished and the captain is awaiting her return. Everyone is doing their best. She begged him to help her as he had said he was there for that purpose. She looks at him after saying those words. Soon she was startled by the skeleton behind him, who said that the Lord's choice would determine the situation. Rosalina then looks at her, sitting on the floor. The Lord asks if people are dying in the city. Patrick remembered that they must be at their limit and asked Mel's for a favor, who was also very curious. From a magic circle, a giant eye with wings emerges. She commanded the creature to go straight to the point and not deviate along the way. Now the creature flies over the city towards the barricade made by the citizens. A large screen appears in front of them. It is possible to see that the people are being overwhelmed and the zombies are numerous. This is not the scene Rosalina or the Lord wanted to see. Patrick says it won't be easy for them to stay alive much longer. Rosalina begins to despair seeing what is happening to the city. She was remembering the people who had taken her in. They were being killed by the zombies. The scene is desperate for her. She asks how Swald can do nothing in the face of this as he is strong and could save them. Rosalina turns her attention to the Lord who is there. She asked what she was doing while the people were dying slowly, and she asked again, energetically, what she was doing. The Lord then begs Swald. She asks him to save them all as time is running out, to do everything possible to save whoever is still alive. The sound of his firm steps echoes through the hall. He is heading towards the front line. Now that she had asked, he will do as she requested. After all, it's not something difficult to do. The three are heading toward the mass of zombies. The sound of battle fills the streets. The innkeeper is thrown to the ground by one of the zombies. He said those monsters are not weak at all. He didn't expect all of them to be wiped out easily. With a zombie approaching him, he imagines he will meet his inevitable end. Before the worst could happen, a foot smashes the head of the undead. Mel's had arrived and found it disgusting to do. She tries to clean her foot and regrets not landing on a rooftop. Seeing the new figure, the other zombies head towards her, but they are too noisy for her. A small butterfly flies toward them. A large explosion happens and more butterflies fly through the city streets. The violet-colored flames consume the undead like they were pieces of paper. It doesn't take any effort on her part. The man who was just saved imagines she is an angel. She gets irritated by the comment he made, and as retaliation, she kicks him in the stomach. She told him to get out of there if he values his life. He runs and she says she should never have been compared to an angel. Helping humans is something she never thought she would do one day. In front of her, the Lich appears to face her. Seeing her, he recognizes that she is a demon and not a human. With so much mana and in humanoid form, she is either a dragon or a demon king. What he doesn't understand is the reason she is siding with the humans. She says she does what she wants, and an undead like him shouldn't question a king. But he says he will get the truth after he rips it from her guts. He also suggested that she become undead, as she would be much stronger. She doesn't know what he means by that, but he is certainly the most talkative undead she has ever seen. The Lich says he is the commander of that army, the darkness of the 10 malevolent ones, that he is Magus and would not lose to a demon king. Around her, grotesque creatures begin to emerge. Even so, she says she has no idea what he's talking about, because it won't be her who will face him now. Magus is a little surprised to hear that. It doesn't take long for him to feel he is being washed by an even greater evil. Swald says that he has finally found him, and he said he would make sure never to forget him. Magus knows who is in front of him. Before he could continue speaking, his face was smashed by a well-delivered punch. The force of the blow sent him flying several meters. Swald looks at the path of destruction that Magus' body left behind. Delivering that punch wasn't so bad after all. If he's right, Magus is one of the dungeon guardians. In the face of his strength, not only Mel's but also the undead that were terrified. Mel's asks if he knew the Lich, as it seemed like he had a personal grudge against him. He said that hours ago, Magus had tried to use his mana to look inside him without permission, and he should have punched him more times. In any case, staying there wouldn't help much. He wanted to know if Erebos was already in the city. She said probably not yet. In the sky, there's a barrier to trap people inside. Whoever created it must be outside, and she couldn't break the barrier, but Swald was already prepared to deal with it himself. He asked if she could handle the remaining minions, and he asked her to try to minimize human losses because they needed the city to keep functioning, and she said she could manage. Swald patted her on the head because he was going to have a conversation with Erebos now. The common zombies continue attacking. They are quite numerous in the city. The horde of undead advances non-stop. Mel's wants to know how long he will take. Swald says no more than 15 minutes, and that if it wasn't more than 20 minutes, she would manage just fine. With that, she wished him a good journey. It was time to end things. Magus said he had a hunch about this person. Then he asked if he was an ancient monster. Swald said he was partially correct, but Magus wanted to know this monster's identity. Probably Patrick's slave, he says, but Magus knows that doesn't make sense. Calling him a fool, he says Swald wouldn't have stood there in front of him doing nothing. For Magus hadn't disappointed his lord Erebos yet. Lightning begins to strike across the city. Magus needed to use that distraction to reach Erebos and tell him everything that was happening. As he retreated, he was surprised. Swald was untouched. The attack hadn't harmed him at all. Even so, that lich continued to irritate him. Now seeing what he sees, Magus is filled with horror. The one before him is truly an ancient monster. Before him stands Swallow, the only monster capable of stopping his master's plans. So he begins to flee because things have become truly dangerous. He needs to reach Erebos as soon as possible. Trying to escape the evil that haunts him, he keeps distancing himself from the conflict. But the shadows are already above his head, and he tries to move even faster. The jaws of the shadow are closing in on him. A large mouth appears, swallowing him like a piece of candy. But even though the attack was massive, Magus is still flying freely. Swald realizes he hasn't swallowed him yet. The lich is faster than he had imagined. Now far away, he passes through the barrier via a portal. Swald watches Magus escape. He tried to swallow him in a single bite, but couldn't. Chasing him down would be a hassle, but he couldn't just ignore what had happened. And he remembered that Mel's would hold out for about 20 minutes. Looking in her direction, he acknowledges that he's worried. With that in mind, he can't waste any more time on this situation. He gathers his energy in the palm of his hand as he assumes Erebos must be outside the barrier. If Magus really wanted to escape, he would have to stay near the castle walls. Magus looks at the intense glow forming behind him. A large explosion is building up. Swald's intention is to destroy everything in the direction Magus fled, so he should be caught in the path. A massive trail of destruction lies before him that should have been enough to deal with the lich. Amid the destruction he caused, he can hear Patrick's complaints. He walks through the huge trench and ends up finding something. It's the lich's body now lying motionless on the ground. He picks him up and says the city's destruction is his fault, and he drags him along to show Patrick who was responsible for everything. At the city's edge, he finally finds the barrier that separates them from the outside world. Strong enough to withstand Mel's power. It must be a very good barrier, but he wants to know how strong it really is. But just by touching it, his hand passes through with no difficulty. However, his hand is shredded in the process. He pulls his hand back and says that it is impressive. He thinks he can pass through it, but hopes the bracelet on his arm will withstand the process. If he changes form during the process, he'll have to hear a lot from Patrick. But if everything goes wrong, he can blame Magus' corpse. He looks around curiously and confirms there are no humans nearby. Taking a few steps back from the barrier, he positions himself in front of it. Swald is ready to launch a powerful attack. He assumes an intermediate form, ready to destroy the barrier. With that done, he began running toward the barrier and collided violently with it. After the impact, a large opening appeared. The opening was big enough for the barrier to begin to break completely, and pieces of it can be seen falling from the sky. Swald walks outside the city. There were many undead there, so many that he was surprised. The zombies make unintelligible sounds. They approach the calamity ready to attack him, but just touching him makes Swald react and explode his surroundings. Near where he stands, there are several undead who are not zombies. They are Erebos' servants. That is not the proper way to treat a guest, says Swald to Erebos. One of the undead starts moving one of its many arms. A sword is stuck in the ground as soon as it finishes gesturing. The horde of zombies begins to move. The crowd advancing towards Swald is enormous. Then he realizes that this is what he should have done from the beginning. The more powerful undead present there. They simply observe him without saying a word. He throws Magus' body in their direction, saying it's a gift. From the shadows, Erebos watches what is happening. Swald says that apparently they have much to discuss now. Erebos emerges from the shadows. The figure in front of him is also an ancient monster. He asks if Swald agrees that these races should also be oppressed by humans. In response to those words, Swald says nothing. Humans are proud, rude, and selfish. Even when their lives are good, they continue invading the lands of other races, Erebos says. Swald orders him to cut the small talk and get straight to the point. Erebos wants to exterminate all humans. He also said that Swald has the strength to destroy the Empire. Erebos believed that the Empire's downfall could only happen if the capital were destroyed, and he knew that Swald attacked the capital not too long ago. If he had said so before, every demon would have been willing to help him in the process. But Swald tells him once again to get straight to the point. Erebos says that if he weren't so careless, it wouldn't have been necessary for so many demons to die. That way, they could have eliminated the humans. At this, Swald understands that Erevos is blaming him for everything he did in the city of Harston. Erevos says that's exactly right, but Swald is quick to deny it. It seems that the demon wants to exterminate the humans and Swald is standing in his way. Hearing that, Erevos says he is disappointed. There's nothing else to say about this situation but that. A large magic circle begins to form in the sky. A huge paw starts to emerge from the portal. Swald is curious because he doesn't know what it could be. It is an undead beast resembling a tapir. Contemplating the size of the creature descending from the heavens, he prepares himself and removes the bracelet from his arm that contained his form. The beast touches the ground after falling. The earth beneath it shakes with the impact. Inside the city, mells of butterflies are no longer so numerous, and the number of undead doesn't seem to have been reduced. She prepares her staff to continue attacking them. Some butterflies approach the hostile mass. They are immediately incinerated by her magic. With them so spread out, she has no choice but to move as well. Looking at the sky, she knows the barrier is almost divine level, and that it was destroying as expected of Swald. Remembering what he said, she realized that not even 3 minutes had passed yet. Behind her, a man is approaching. It's the captain. He asked her if everyone was safe. Pointing to the fire, she said if he was asking about the other humans, they are burning there. Almost collapsing, he asked if she was with the knights as well. The one in armor and the other who looks like a wanderer. But she says she is not their companion. She is actually a servant and nowhere near their greatness. Realizing they are together, he is happy that Rosalina succeeded in asking for help. Thought didn't sacrifice himself in vain, the city would be saved. He tells her that soon he will also become undead. She says she knows that, and even though she's not in a position to ask, she would like to request a favor from him. Melz observes him in his final moments. Looking more closely, he realizes she isn't human. Regardless, that doesn't matter now. If there was a weapon nearby, he would like her to give it to him. Melz ponders his request. The captain is already on the ground, completely drained of strength. A spear is thrown into the ground before him. He is a warrior, and Melz knows that. Finally, the captain takes the spear in his hands and uses it for what he intended. Up in the sky, Melz notices a sinister aura ahead. The ground has been churned by the impact. The giant elephant is standing, searching for Swald. Another strange figure appeared. With little effort, Swald throws it far away, as Erevos, who was watching from a distance, expected. Swald truly deserves the title of an ancient monster. He looks at the giant elephant and realizes that his core is different from the others. The beast attacks, launching several blasts. It was so fast that Swald couldn't dodge. He quickly noticed that one of his legs was forming swollen wounds. A great magic is summoned from the heavens, the Fangs of Malice. A divine class spell, not even an ancient monster would be able to resist it. Erevos watches the destruction unfold before him. It was definitely marvelous to see. The zombies continue advancing. Despite being the target of a powerful spell, Swald remains composed. However, Erevos has doubts about what's happening. Watching from afar, he imagines things are going well. He now believes that he will finally defeat the ancient beast. With that, he aims to fill the entire land with undead, thus attaining the position of ruler over everything and everyone. Another attack is heading towards Swald, just like the first one struck him. To Erevos, the beast should be grateful for the chance to leave after so many years with nothing to do in life. The anchors that were embedded in the beast suddenly begin to explode. At this, Swald's eyes change color, returning to their traditional yellow. It's his turn to react to the attacks and do something. It didn't take long for a massive explosion of gigantic proportions to occur. That which had bound the beast and was embedded in its body no longer exists, as it had been shattered. Erevos could only watch in disbelief. Swald remarked that it hurt enough that he wouldn't want to be hit by that attack again. Now it dawns on Erevos, it wasn't he who struck the beast, but the beast who allowed him to do all of this. Erevos strikes a nearby tree. Some of his subordinates are confused by what they're seeing because he actually struck a tree. Lord of all death looks at his hand. Swald thinks he's gone mad, as he also doesn't understand why he attacked the tree. However, he asks if that was the most powerful magic Erevos had, because if that was all, there wasn't much else to be done. Erevos' rage stems from understanding that Swald let himself be hit just to gauge the strength of his attacker. It's obvious now that Erevos doesn't stand a chance in this fight, and he knows he needs to get out of there. He was too hasty, ruining his plans. He needs to create a distraction and flee immediately. Swald approaches, remarking about the magic that Erevos didn't respond to, and says he had spoken to him. He was firm, telling Erevos not to come up with any more stupid ideas. If Erevos had a more powerful attack than that, now would be the time to use it. Erevos stands before the ancient beast, completely powerless. Even so, he says nothing, to which Swald asks why the silence. The only conclusion is that Erevos has nothing left up his sleeve, no stronger attack to use. But amid the silence, something begins to emerge from Erevos' chest. The pillars still remaining in the sky begin to descend. It only takes the ancient beast to move slightly to defend itself. And it even commented that the predictability was so great, it was as if they were reading the same script. One of the pillars was thrown far away. The same fate befell the other one. Erevos imagines that his distraction worked. Swald was bound by magical chains. That type of enchantment is what he hates most, and he began to agonize. A green circle was forming on the body of the zombie elephant. Looking at it, Swald imagines it's another divine class spell, and even so, the animal was incredibly resilient. Trapped, he would be attacked with no chance to defend himself. Even so, the attack happens, and he complains that it was a very dirty move. Now in his human form, walking calmly, he says that it's far too disgusting. But since things have progressed to this point, he can take her seriously now. Whatever was controlling the reanimated body of the zombie elephant has no idea what's happening. A massive head emerges from the ground to swallow it. Out of range, Arevos continues watching without fleeing. The enormous head devours everything in its path like a small snack. There's nothing to be said in the face of such an atrocious scene. Just as it appeared from the ground, it recedes back into it. Swald returns to his human form. Meanwhile, Arevos still watches without making a move. Looking at him, Swald remarks that maybe it's time to replace the boss of one of the 7 great dungeons. The people continue trying to survive in the city. Rosalina and the Lord hear Patrick talking to himself. He feels like his boss has forgotten that he is a calamity and things could get worse. He'll be the one tasked with cleaning up the mess afterward. A loud noise causes them to take cover. The Lord asks what is happening. Patrick, despondent, says that his boss is causing a mess, meaning he's handling the undead army. She asks if that means Harston will be saved. In a way, yes, but not in the way she thinks, as his bones are shivering. At least there are no more undead in the city. Mel's had taken care of most of them. She approaches them and says that it was quite exhausting. It had been a long time since she used so much mana, and Patrick thanks her for her efforts, saying that without her, things would have been different. Despite this, she says Swald did most of the work, but Patrick is adamant that she did something better. Mel's asks if he's finished yet, but Patrick says the fight is still ongoing. That power is something to behold, and thinking about the aftermath is even worse. The skeleton laments as his boss always causes more work every time he tries to fix something. After this, there will be plenty of work for him for sure. Swald only needed to step on them a few times, but instead he's doing something worse. Patrick is upset because he will have to deal with it all. Someone calls out to Rosalina, who was watching the battle from afar. She turned to see who was calling her. The skeleton said the only person they promised to keep alive there was the Lord. So it was time for him to begin the cleanup now. There's no purpose in leaving more people alive in that place except for the Lord. She intervenes, saying that the girl is one of her subordinates. The skeleton looks at them both threateningly. With good humor, he says it's fine, there's no need for all of that. It's not like she can do much for herself anyway, since the thieves who took her in are no longer alive. And with her mind in that state, there's not much else to be done. Acting against her could make the Lord react worse than he imagines. That would be a problem they don't want to create. So things will go as they were defined, and he called for Mel's, who was resting on the ground. He wants to know if she can put someone to sleep, and she said yes, asking who. Patrick says he'd like to speak to the Lord alone. Immediately, Mel's puts Rosalina to sleep with magic. Now they would begin their conversation. It was time for her to fulfill her part of the promise, and the Lord wants to know what she must do. She should not tell anyone what she has seen so far, and Patrick says she must have realized that without him meaning to tell her. He was going to tell her a story now about a lord who received all kinds of insults for wanting to save his land. Upon seeing the undead attack, he did everything he could to protect them. But there were few soldiers and he could only ask for help. He didn't get the help in time, and the people criticized him even more as the undead advanced. His only option was to hold out firmly. After a long wait, reinforcements from the Empire arrived and drove the undead away. And with that, the territory was saved. End of this wonderful story. She was in a frightened lord who hid away, but someone who sacrificed herself to save her people. The Lord asks if she should lie. Patrick points to the city. He says she mentioned before that she wanted to live. With those words, she understands what she needs to do now. He tells her to distribute supplies to the survivors and that soon help from other cities would arrive. She doesn't know if that will happen, but Patrick says he will take care of the rest because the young Lord of Harston is a heroine. Even after hearing that, she still feels a bit apprehensive. The silence is now enormous, so Swald must have finished everything. He suggests that Mel's teleport them, but she's used so much mana that she might not be able to do it. Seeing that they are about to leave, the Lord wishes to ask them something. What was their intention in saving this city? Since they are dungeon monsters, it wasn't for the lives of the people. Patrick says she wanted to live and should know her place and not ask so many questions. Swald remarks that it's about time to replace one of the 7 great dungeons, and he feels a little sorry for Arevos, because all of this could have been avoided if he had just stayed quiet somewhere. He says his back has been pierced so many times that it's starting to itch. Arevos says he is once again impressed by the strength of the ancient beast, but Swald says he doesn't care about that. Now he wants to know why it had to be Harston, because if it hadn't been that city, he wouldn't have had to intervene. Arevos says it was the best location to attack the Empire's capital, but that's not what Swald wants to hear. That means Arevos came here knowing who owned this territory. Arevos, on the other hand, asks if Swald knows the real reason. A great magic begins to form behind him. Seeing what is starting to appear, Swald changes his stance. Several spikes emerge from the undead's body. Swald continues to observe him carefully, and now the Lich is laughing uncontrollably. More magic circles appear behind him. and a massive explosion occurs, engulfing Erevos completely. When it ends, the head falls with no body to hold it. Swald realizes Erevos wasn't trying to use teleportation magic. Taking the head, he says it wouldn't have mattered, as Erevos was going to meet his end anyway. He looks back to survey the place. Everywhere he looks, there's destruction. The destruction is so extensive that he realizes what he's done. Something needs to be done because the place has become useless. This time, it's Swald who starts to feel a chill. Mel's had arrived, and with her, Patrick too. The skeleton calls out to him and Swald's expression changes, knowing he's in trouble. Patrick tells him not to move as he's coming over, saying he missed him. This is the proof he needed to confirm he's really in deep trouble. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.